We got somebody from Cuba was supposed to be on the panel. She couldn't make it in the end. We identified somebody from London, somebody from Norway, somebody from Asia. In the end, we are the two of us, Jimmy and I, and we probably will still be joined by the Asian colleague, but otherwise we'll just go ahead with the discussion. The theme is on the marketization of social science. Usually, much of the debate about marketization is actually discussing it in relation to higher education more generally. So there are very few papers one can find discussing the marketization of social science only. And the marketization of higher education, it is, although the sector, the higher education sector is the sector where social science is also located, where social sciences are taught, where social science research is carried out for much of it. And it is therefore a sector to which there have been attempts, particularly over the past couple of years, to apply free trade rules, particularly with what is happening at the level of the World Trade Organization. It's GATS and TRIPS, these are acronyms referring to the application, basically, and to put it simply, the application of free trade rules to the education sector. And so that the function of higher education is actually what is often discussed. And that discussion has become, much more important over the past few years. But before I continue, I just want to remind us that there actually have been different phases in the processes of marketization. And in the literature, one finds 3 phases identified. The first phase, which dates back to the 19th century, was about mainly the marketization of labor, commodification of labor, basically. The second phase was began towards the end of the 19th century, continued after in between the 2 world wars and immediately after. And then the third phase is the phase of neoliberal reforms and the process of neoliberalization of everything. And so the discussion about marketization usually is related to this most recent phase of liberalization and of marketization, which is the marketization of neoliberal marketization, where it's like nature, land, and the environment and everything are subjected to market rules. And what the truth is, all over the world, the production of knowledge has been brought under pressure as a result of this process of marketization, and pressure to respond basically to the demands of the market. And with the market being defined in most cases in very narrow terms that correspond to the neoliberal acception of it. And marketization has particularly played itself out in the social sciences, we are trying to argue as well, not only in higher education, but one can see it in the social sciences themselves. If only because disciplines have been ranked more or less in terms of their market value. Courses are ranked in terms of their market value. And within disciplines, there are also subdivisions that have emerged. You can have certain aspects of certain disciplines which are now said to be non-marketable and therefore are not attracting students and not getting researchers to take interest in them either. And these are the issues that we want to discuss in this panel. I start off with just asking the rhetorical question: is social science marketable to begin with? And that will be my own presentation. And then Jimmy will continue the discussion. There is a general thing now being said about knowledge being a factor of production. There are several publications making this argument. Knowledge, a factor of production. In one publication of the World Bank and UNESCO that came out in the year 2000, Higher Education in Developing Countries, the subtitle is Peril and Promise. In that publication, it is argued that knowledge is a factor of production that is as important as the other factors of production, or probably even more important than the other factors of production. 2 years later, 4 years later, actually, this was a publication that came out in 2000. In 2004, the World Bank came out with another publication on higher education, and the subtitle being the Lessons of Experience. And that one seemed to have actually toned down what was said in the first report, the report that came out in the year 2000, because that one, UNESCO wasn't involved any longer. In both cases, there's a strong argument in favor of knowledge and people talking about knowledge economies and knowledge societies. When one looks at it much more closely, it's actually a certain understanding of what kind of knowledge, there are certain kinds of knowledge being referred to. And it is usually is the knowledge that is marketable, immediately usable. When talking about courses, there are courses that attract students, fee-paying students preferably, and therefore that the universities can use to increase the funds that they have at their disposal. Now, somebody, Burowe, sociologist Michael Burowe, made a critique of the Gulbenkian report, saying that the Gulbenkian report was utopian. I think these guys are trying to enter. The Gulbenkian report, which was published in 1996, and it's a report of the Gulbenkian Commission on the restructuring of the social sciences. That the commission was led by Immanuel Wallenstein. And the report argued in favor of a kind of unification of the social sciences. And they were saying that, look, the process that is going on now is a unification of the sciences, basically, and that a number of factors are militating towards a unification of the social sciences. So Burowe, actually critiques this report 10 years later in an article that came out in 2006, which is a keynote lecture he gave to the Sociological Association of Portugal. He said, look, that report was utopian in the sense that it didn't, what is going on with marketization is not a process towards a unification of the social sciences, but a process towards further diversification and segmentation of the social sciences. And so he says that the report is actually faulty in two respects. One is because the commission is a commission that was made of elites who were detached from the realities of the knowledge production world. The elites who were operating from elite institutions and who really were disconnected, with the actual social processes. Number two, they located their analysis in the second processes. They are still in the kind of the second process of marketization that took place, and not the final one under neoliberal reforms. In the second phase, the state still had a role. Issues of academic freedom and institutional autonomy were still important. The third thing is, he said the commission didn't ask the fundamental question of knowledge for who. Because when you ask the question of the knowledge for who, then you begin to see that there are different kinds of knowledge. The reflexive one and the knowledge for, which is, what is in ordinary parlance called applied knowledge for policy purposes and so on. And that those distinctions are important. So the report was faulty in a sense. And it's arguing that, in fact, what is happening, now is the opposite of what they are arguing for. And that to get to a unification of the social sciences, you need a completely different route. So anyway, as to the question whether social science is marketable, therefore, we situated debate in this particular context. And the question, therefore, is whether market principles can be applied to the social sciences. And I think if you were to follow the neoliberal logic, strictly speaking, the social sciences too would have to operate along market lines, basically, in the sense that they could be seen as producing knowledge, which could be seen as a commodity that has to be of use to certain constituencies, and therefore that should be subjected to the laws of supply and demand. And therefore, by implication, if the knowledge that is being produced by the social science is of no interest to anybody, then it means that it is not a social science that has any value. But historically, of course, since the age of the Enlightenment, the social sciences were seen more like producers of knowledge for the greater good of humanity and humanity in its entirety. I'm referring here to several papers by Kathleen Lynch in particular. And the universities where the social sciences are taught and where much of the research is carried out were seen as watchdogs for the free interchange of ideas in a democratic society. And the students are educated in that context to be critical citizens. And the universities claim to protect the freedom of thought, including the freedom of dissent from prevailing orthodoxies. And therefore, there are institutions which are in the realm of the public good, which produce public goods. and which are defined as institutions that defend the public interest. It is supposed to be disinterested research, therefore, which is not driven by a market logic or a profit motive, in a sense. And with the neoliberal counter-revolution, what happened, therefore, has been kind of a reversal of that logic, in the sense that now the users of knowledge are seen as consumers, basically, and therefore the knowledge had to be of interest to those to the consumers, and the citizen is a citizen-consumer sort of, in a sense. And that we knew. Now, what I want to say here is this is a phenomenon that is a global phenomenon. Since the Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, arrival in the scene, we have seen a push of that particular neoliberal logic at various levels. It is not only a third world problem. It is not only an African problem. There are examples as to what is going on in Ireland, for example, where disciplines that are supposedly not very marketable or are critical are disciplines that are underfunded, much less funded than the disciplines that are supposed to be much more marketable. Here in Norway, there are a certain number of incentives that are also given to scholars who publish in English, which are much more important than scholars who publish in Norwegian languages, for example, in Norwegian journals, as a way of encouraging them. But in a sense, you're also creating hierarchies in terms of the articles and the outlets of the publications. So what marketization has done is to strengthen the consumer kind of orientation, whether or not there is a profit motive to the knowledge produced or not, or the production of knowledge. And this has led to the infusion of a utilitarian logic, and I think that's the most worrying part of it. There's an instrumentalization of knowledge and of social science among other disciplines, which in effect means that there is a whole debate as to what is, or a redefinition of what is even just good science and what is not good science, what is relevant and what is not relevant, what is of quality and what is of not such good quality. And this utilitarian logic is something that we suffer, greatly from in the context of Africa, where research is even less funded and taken less seriously, social science research in particular, than in other parts of the world, where you have a number of mechanisms that are in place to support research. It came to us primarily through the structural adjustment processes. But structural adjustment came, we are now in a post-adjustment age or in a post-Washington consensus age, but the impact is still with us today. Until today, what is taken for good research and what is taken for serious research is something that is determined along lines of what is relevant to the demands of the labor market, or what is relevant to the demands of policymakers. Now, this process has been encouraged, as I said earlier on, by the fact that the World Trade Organization has come into the scene with its GATS, the General Agreement on Trades and Services, and the TRIPS, and which means that there is a particular push of the neoliberal logic in the context of the services and knowledge production in particular. In short, it means the application of free trade rules to higher education and to the sciences as well. What it has done is to bring about a reclassification of disciplines into the, as I said, marketable and non-marketable ones. The marketable ones are those that attract students, that are of interest to all the potential users of research, whether they're NGOs or donors or international organizations. When we're talking about students, we're talking about fee-paying students in particular. And I think Mahmoud Mamdani's study on the experience of Makerere University has published a book, not the most recent. The most recent one is Darfur, Survival, in Darfur. But the one before is titled Scholars at the Marketplace, discussing the Makerere experience of, literally commercializing almost everything at the level of the university, and the different ways in which it has, reclassified disciplines and favored some and disfavored others. More importantly, I think, and more worrying, is that it has changed to lead to a change in cultures, actually. The universities are seen less and less as centers of learning and more as business centers, sort of, with productivity targets. Even the public universities, I mean, it has become, there's a wave of private universities that has been coming up. New universities have been created. In some countries, actually, the private universities have outnumbered the public universities. In Senegal in particular, and in several other countries, the private universities have outnumbered the public universities. But the public universities themselves are now pressed to function almost like the private institutions in terms of being able to raise their own monies, providing services, getting into consultancies and commission studies of this kind, and responding to needs of industry, even though there's a big question about the importance of that industry in a number of contexts. And I think that has been a very important shift. And there is what Lynch calls a relatively silent colonization of the hearts and minds of academics and students happening at the universities. So that the seemingly apolitical nature of the neoliberal agenda has led to a depoliticization of education by hiding its ideological underpinnings in a language of economic efficiency. Now, this in effect amounts to a refocusing of research and teaching in the universities as well. Now, Lynch argues further that this has led to what he calls a graded elitism of, a gradual elision of the divide between scholarly research and commercial undertakings. It has also led to a reinterpretation of the notion of institutional autonomy. In Africa, when we, for a long time, talk about academic freedom and institutional autonomy is inherent to the life of a university if it has to function properly as a university. In the context of structural adjustment and what followed, universities are being encouraged to be on their own, basically, simply because the state wants to shed off its responsibility in terms of funding the universities. They already, even when they are funded, there are statistics on Ghana and other countries. The budgets are not so important, but more importantly, in those budgets, the budgets for research are ridiculously low. And even in that context now, the universities have been told, look, you need to find your own funds, you need to be functioning, watching costs and engaging in cost recovery activities and so on. And that is a very, very, very serious threat to the social sciences. And it is a threat to critical social science in particular. And among the social sciences, and I think that's what also one has to admit, there are disciplines that tend to adapt much more easily to these challenges, and there are disciplines that are disfavored. The discipline that has been favored in this process has been economics mainly, much more than the other disciplines. And economics, particularly neoclassical economics, is what the sub-discipline of economics that has really been favored. And the other disciplines obviously are much less favored. Now, a few things about to come back to the debate that I said Bureau had with the Gulbenkian Commission report. Back to the notion of the three waves of marketization that occurred. Biswas also makes this argument in a paper on West Bengal, on social sciences and higher education in West Bengal. First of all, in terms of the responses of the social sciences, economics in particular has undergone a transformation in a sense in which, because the neoclassical economics has taken the fore in the discipline of economics. Sociology was born, it is argued by a number of scholars, in response to the first wave of marketization, which occurred in Europe, basically. The marketization of labor and the crisis that went with that. The history of sociology, takes a particular turn in that context. What the third wave has done, and the current wave of neoliberal reform, which is also in a sense the wave of marketization that took place with globalization, is actually to get even the disciplines that have been adapting like sociology itself to be to shift in its focus, in the sense that it is argued that if it has to play the same role that it played at the beginning, it maybe has to take greater interest in issues such as human rights and and addressing the concerns of the communities that are disempowered, that are much less favored by the current waves. I think what I want to say here at this level is that sociology, what could be said about sociology could be said about the other disciplines as well, and that I think the social sciences are differentiated in the way they are affected by the marketization logic. There are certain sub-disciplines that do well, and certain sub-disciplines that are affected more severely. There are science aspects of the discipline which have been transformed sort of yet much more to applied purposes. And so long as that process is on, that there's a differentiation within the disciplines themselves. There's a differentiation among these disciplines of social sciences. There's a differentiation between countries. And there are differentiations in experiences. It's absolutely impossible to talk about a reunification of these social sciences. I think from what I want to say to end this introductory presentation here is that in the context of Africa, it's not only the market logic that we are sort of having to deal with. It's also that, as I said earlier on, there are differences in countries. The powerhouses of knowledge are located in the north. The journals that are seen to be most important are located in the north. Therefore, the criteria for determining what is good social science and what is not good social science is not only for us to determine, basically, and that there is a struggle over that particular kind of definition. So, are the social sciences marketable? I would say yes, if we mean by being marketable, being able to be, being able to respond to demands, being felt to be, needed in a sense by the communities and by the users of science and by the users of knowledge that social sciences are producing. But it is a sad reality that we are observing, and that is the reduction of social sciences to a very narrow definition of marketization, of what is marketable, in the sense that they are supposed to be producing knowledge that can be identified as a commodity. And that is far from the critical social science that social science has been seen to be initially. And social science that gives voice to the subalterns, and that takes the side of the oppressed, and that is why Burowe argues in his paper that if social science wants to save itself from the travesty of marketization that is taking place, it has to take the issue of rights much more seriously and take that to be its new challenge. And I think I'll just stop there to allow Jimmy to come into the discussion. Yeah, I don't know how long have I spoken.
Can I stand up? It helps
me.
Yeah,
no problem.
I think better when I'm on my feet. I think that will watch well. Thank you, Ebrima. I've always said that in the course of Codestria, African social science community, I'm a soldier. So I was a trooper who was drafted, So it's not as bad as Vietnam, but yeah. Now, I actually, it's an especially important, subject to deal with. And we'll try and sketch some of these things complementary to Brima's presentation. But I actually think that, if we're having this discussion 10 years ago, it will have been, what do you call it, despair, gloom and doom and things like that. And, the neoliberal agenda playing itself out, exhausting itself, wasn't just a question of subprime market or the financial something. I think a number of those experiments and, are actually quite clear in the higher education and social science. Well, let's use higher education and research generally. And that my sense is that actually we've turned the corner. We will be talking to the converted if we just, recount it. And I would go through some of this. And therefore, I think there's, in fact, greater room for optimism now than perhaps, 10 years ago. Definitely, if you asked me this question 10 years ago, we were on the barricade. The fight got to the point where it had to be on the street. 15 years ago, it was enormous despair. But I'm actually a lot more encouraged today, and I'll cover that. I think Ebrima has focused on the question of the what we call the genealogy of this problem. The only thing that I would like to add to that is it's important for people to remember this. 1986, there was a World Bank. It wasn't a World Bank conference. Actually, it was a meeting of the African vice chancellors in Harare. And the World Bank, there was this famous World Bank declaration, what is called the Harare Declaration, which basically we were told this was a position of the bank. Africa does not need higher education. Look, and again, it's this private returns argument, and that if you look at the private returns versus public expenditure on higher education, the returns to the private is more than public benefit. And Djibouti is there. It doesn't have a university, and it hasn't done badly. It hasn't done anything. You actually never hear about Djibouti. And I think the whole idea of the liberalization, and there was huge resistance, by the way. There was huge resistance on the part of the African vice chancellors. Enormous resistance at that meeting. Because we hear about it, the Harare Declaration, but not the response of the people who basically said, no, this is not what education is about. We need this thing. It just, And then, of course, as it happens, every 10 years, the bank, changes its mind or discovers something that's new, that everybody knew. And it's one of those things, sound bites, knowledge economy. Have you ever heard of an ignorant economy before? I don't understand. Every economy requires some form of knowledge framework. But just like with the economy, just like with the politics, the change in the higher education system did not come because the vice chancellors cop out. All the universities actually require, regime change. Quite, in many cases, in which countries were squeezed, in which countries you had literally guns put to your head. And if you're in the case of Kampala, where you're just told you've got to do 1, 2, 3 if you want money for X, Y, Z. All right. Now, it's also quite interesting to see the logic of the argument. When they finally agreed, okay, you can hold your universities, you can have the universities, but you've got to do a different story change about how the universities function. The argument was equity. That in fact, this whole idea about rent-seeking activities of the urban coalition, who damage development investment because they can capture things for themselves, and that this new elite, which is quite interesting. If you are a minimum wage worker, just because you belong to a union, how you become an elite, I don't understand. But the argument was that it's an equity argument. That if you pull the public resources out and you allow, then you can use for those who actually need it. Because the elite can pay for their own children's education. They can pay for their own children's education. So if there is public money available, let's spend it on the children of the peasants, the children of some. And some of the guys who are making the arguments were friends. David Cott was one of the. David Cott was among the left something in. Kampala during the Dar es Salaam days. The remarkable example, and you can take that, Makerere as an example. And Makerere bought into this essentially as just a model, for the rest. You can replay the story in other parts of the continent. On the basis that, look, we can't do this, but let's see what we can do with it. At the time of the thing, publicly funded students in Makerere were 80%. Privately funded students were about 20%. Okay, 20%, 80%. Many of the 80% were public funded from the government budget and this or that. Now, if you track the amount of money that actually comes from the treasury to the university, it didn't decline. All right? But 10 years later, the story has changed. 80% of the students in Makerere were privately funded, and only 20% were publicly funded. But the damage it did was a lot more profound, and you have variations because we talk about this. You don't have this phenomenon, for instance, in Mauritius. You won't find it in Mauritius. The phenomenon also is not in any way that you find in Botswana. In Ghana, it was a more contested thing, you know, and Makerere and Dar es Salaam were actually effort at this thing. In some other places, it was just an abandonment of the situation. If you look at Nigeria and Ghana, for instance, you could see where in Ghana there was an attempt by the political elite, if you want to call them Rawlings and others, to actually defend higher education. Okay? Whereas in the case of Nigeria, it was like you got external support to help you deal with these intellectuals who are always criticizing government. And in the case of Nigeria, you had a drop in the percentage of the GDP that was spent on education from 6% in 1980 to 0.65% in 1994. Now, it wasn't just a 10% drop, because it was a drop from about 3-point-something billion to about 80 million, dollars. Okay, the impact was a lot more. But it did two things simultaneously, which are quite important for keeping the integrity of an intellectual community. First, you will find people who are giving their valedictory lectures. I mean, one of the famous ones in Ibadan, Professor Olubumo, a mathematician, who gave his inaugural valedictory lecture. Is what does it all amount to? It's somewhere about 30 years after this thing. You don't have enough pension to actually see you through the day. You can't change your carpet. In the late 70s, it was a privilege to be invited back for graduate studies. By the early 90s, we could not keep our best students. And we were now having to make do with people who normally you would never consider for postgraduate studies. People who are the second class lower, okay? And this. Then, of course, there was the exit, okay? Because people went for their PhDs, and then, either you come back and you can't handle because there is no thing. In the humanities, social science, it was a lot better. In the natural sciences, it was a bloodbath, okay? And the implication, the impact there, because if one applies an institutional, sociological institutional model to this kind of thing, a knowledge system and institutional integrity, what we call universities, what we call the national systems of innovation, it's like a conveyor belt. You have to connect one generation to the next. You have to connect one generation to the next. The transmission of collective memory actually happens in this process. One of the fundamental problems around that period was to break that chain. Of the 135 who graduated in my class in Ibadan, and were still considered the golden generation of that class, I don't know, it was fortuitous, about 85% are outside. In other words, the benefit that you had in which one generation could hand over and the debate and memories of argument that happened, the same thing in Dar es Salaam. If you go to Dar es Salaam today, people who are heads of department and you ask them about the Dar debate, you'll be surprised if you get people who can actually tell you. Not because they're not there physically, but the generation that could have handed over that story in the classroom, in the debate and this and that. And that was fundamental damage to the intellectual integrity of African social science. At the level of Codestria, we haven't felt it because Codestria has never suffered brain drain, but because it's a watering hole. But at institutional level, it's been enormously damaging. Now, but the interesting thing is also the failure of the model. I think there's no doubt about that now, that model has failed abysmally. In the South African context, we've been lucky in the sense that, there's been, because it's a system that is able to fund a lot of its own needs internally, and even at the level of universities, you can take University of Cape Town, for instance, as a classical example. I can take my discipline, sociology. In the, between 94 and 2000, there was this headlong, flow into the thing. And then even UCT realized they couldn't keep its own students. There was this whole thing about program-based learning, outcome-based something. And the result at the end of the day was you realize that we're actually not training students to think. After all, university education is not so much about skills. University education is about training people who can answer in 20 years' time questions we cannot even formulate today. And that foundational thing comes in what is normally called liberal arts education, okay? The whole idea of the impact of philosophy, the whole idea of, and in some of the restructuring that happened, those were the first departments to die. In places where the whole university died, nobody cared what happened. And what you tend to happen to then find there is that universities themselves in response, which is what we have in Makerere, and there's the question of the enemies within. Because a lot of colleagues, for instance, who could then convert their skill and teach us sort of dubious things, there's a business something, and then there are satellite campuses all over the country, or night schools, and that's where you actually made your money. Meant that research suffered because you're trying to make money. But even then, the quality of what was taught, and that has created a major crisis down the line. It has an implication for rebuilding because it's not like a war economy or war environment. I mean, it's not like, look, if there's war and a building is broken, damaged, you can knock down the building and move it, take all this thing and rebuild. Unfortunately, in the question of universities, it doesn't actually work out that way because those who are poorly trained are already, they don't leave the university. They stay. They're now in the positions of leadership. So the fundamental, the damage is in fact much more than just a question of there's no money and if the money comes for research. Because again, scholarship is cultural. I mean, I don't mean cultural in terms of traditional culture, but as learned behavior. Writing paper is not what, I don't know. I mean, maybe you guys are lucky. I still struggle to write every paper. But it's a skill. It's apprenticeship. You learn to do by doing. And if you don't do enough, frequently enough, you lose the skill. It's not just something you can then pick up and say, it's like what is happening now. People, careers have set into, rigor mortis has already set into career. And then they say if you don't have a PhD, you can't become a senior lecturer. Then 25 years into being teacher, you go and get a PhD. It's just like putting a cap on a dead body, I mean, nothing happens, There's no dramatic something because the cultural dimension of the learning has actually been significantly affected. But even so, in many of these universities, at least from my own experience, this is already exhausting itself. There's a realization in many of the universities that it's actually been damaging to the very sense of integrity and being able to produce. And there have been all sorts of efforts, effort to say you impose, an assessment system so that you can try and clean out, I mean, you have people who set up journals, cross the road to a printer, and have this journal that you call journal, and then it's just you, your friend, and me, okay? Me, my friend, and me, and yes, number one, volume 1, number 1, and there are only 3 copies. You put there are only about 20 copies. You post 15 copies to different libraries, so there are, okay? And then your friends make photocopies, and the rest of the journal is just in your hand. Many of those universities have tried to clean those things up, okay, at national levels, and many of these cases and this and that. And therefore, I think if we just spend the next 10 minutes on the whole agenda of rebuilding, because I don't think it's about persuading people. If you go to Dar es Salaam today, I mean, Chachage died, but the issues for which Chachage died, you don't need to. It's not like we used to jump up and down and tell in Senate, we have to return to knowledge production and like, everybody knows that now. But I think it's also important in terms of what drives the knowledge, the rebuilding exercise. And here I'm not saying anything particularly new. It's a debate within the South African context, which I think is being won to an extent. Education as a public good. And it's not just a question of you're doing favors to people. I mean, there's the open access, movement now. I know within the Academy of Science, for instance, there's the Cielo, which is borrowed from the Brazilian thing, science, it's online journal thing. And the idea is to actually, I'm on a subcommittee, dealing with this, is to actually a platform where all the journals are now available online, open access. And the issue is not so much. I mean, the crassness of the marketization, the whole idea of knowledge can be commodified, is that in fact the very basis for knowledge, the epistemic foundation for actually contestation and advancing knowledge, requires that it has to be in the public domain. Now, the remarkable thing, if you take the Human Genome Project, there were two. The US government insisted on funding the public one. And then you had these private companies and a number of something deciding to do that. And the argument within the US government, we're talking about how many, 10 years ago, something years ago, was that it was in the national interest for advancement of scientific knowledge that this knowledge has to be in the public domain. Because that's where the contestation, you're right, no, I'm not right, you're wrong, and this and that, collaboration and this and that the very nature of the advancement of knowledge requires that it has to be in a public domain. A hip to be square, Shatterwall's foundation, for instance, driving the open source, open source movement. Yeah. Okay, it's a private company, but they themselves know that in fact to advance anything you're going to get, it's important to put in the knowledge, in the open something there. Yeah, 6 more minutes and this. But there's also a second dimension, which we've mentioned in other parts. And you can now decide whether you're a conservative, a liberal, a radical, and this and that. But that education, now in terms of access, as a public good, to which we ensure that the brightest and the best, and that obviously involves democratizing access at the childhood education level, for you to decide who is the best and brightest and best, has to be one in which people should have access. Precisely because if you take UK as an example, imagine if all the UK intellectual community was made up of the royal family. I don't want to be silly, Charles had a third class in Cambridge, the younger brother, the other one, and this and that. And you do know that in fact some of the brightest chaps who are working class kids, actually you're told to lose your accent if you want to move. I mean, but the idea is that in fact, open talent sourcing requires that you have to provide. And now we can argue. My preference would be publicly funded, and this and that. And we can say if you're very rich, you can afford this thing. Then we can scale it down from 0% subsidy at university level to 100% subsidy, depending on the income of your parents and this and that. But the idea of open access and for people to access education is actually contest in which globally, nationally, regionally, we can tap into the best talent. As I said in the previous session, you don't have to convince me now that if people are poor, it doesn't mean they're not bright, because there were people who beat me squarely in school, consistently, and whose fathers were carpenters. Okay? Because it's also about tapping into that knowledge environment. Now, but more importantly, this is part of the turn that I thought about earlier on. If we were talking, for instance, even in the context of South Africa, if we were talking 10 years ago, I'll be in utter despair, It's quite interesting, not only is it that universities themselves are realizing it was a huge mistake to go into this market thing, students are my customers, and somebody, you're my customer? Do I look like I'm selling Coca-Cola? And this and that, it's an apprenticeship system. Because essentially there is a dimension to knowledge, which if you go back to what is the original meaning of academe, and by the way, this is not a Eurocentric notion, because the 4 oldest universities in the world on the African continent, 3 of them on the Mediterranean coastline, and the 4th one in Timbuktu. Timbuktu one is gone, but the 2 oldest universities on which, you look your academic gown when you do your graduation and you see the Taliban I mean, don't you know where the origin of the academic gang is? Because this is mainly from Middle East and this and that. You know, the oldest universities were there. But traditionally, the whole idea is this idea of a walk in the groove. Okay, where a student, a teacher, I keep telling people 70% of the education I had as an undergraduate was not what happened in the classroom. Was the argument I had with my professors outside, was Onoge telling me, rigor, I expect more of you. I'm a second year student, stop talking about rigor for me. And then a few minutes later, you said something, I said, can you repeat that? He said, no, before that. He said, I never thought of it that way. This guy, thesis was the best in 10 years in sociology in Harvard. I mean, telling me, from, Odoshambora across the something and this and that I said something that was particularly imaginative for him and this and that. And of course, with my students, if they can't be brighter than you, what do you expect, But it's that, the whole idea that it's just a classroom thing, the fundamental thing is also about reasoning, about thinking. And we know this. Fortunately, in a number of universities, as you can see, a recovery in the growth in philosophy departments, a recovery in growth in history departments and things like that. And I'll just end by saying that, as I said earlier on, the tide has already turned. But we can claim that we are among the converted here. But actually we're not. I don't know about you individually. I mean as this assembly. Because the continuity of the threat to scholarship is within the scholarly community. Each of these faces have grown constituencies within the universities that are defending these things. The regime of reward, which says if you can bring money into the university, that's if you bring money in, or something. There are people who are defending within the university because they made money out of it. And what has it done? It has broken research and teaching. Because if you're a good researcher, the university wants you to concentrate on doing research so that you can bring more money in and you don't have to worry about teaching. But whoever hears of a good teacher at university level who is not a first-class researcher? Because if we're just, what you're going to say in the class is repeating what people can read in the books, what's the point? Man, that's why just be phoning ourselves and say, have you read page 52? Say, yes, okay, all right, okay, thank you. Because the pedagogic project is, in fact, that it's the nexus of research and teaching. We are the ones who are beneficiaries, and I suspect 80% of us who are here in our various universities, in our various areas, we're probably among the first 20%. Let me not say 5%. 20% of top researchers in our universities, in our departments, in our disciplines. We are the threat. And this is why the question of individual responsibility. When Department of Social Development in South Africa gives you a research something to do, you're doing it from the point of view of, I can pay off my mortgage and I can buy, replace my BMW. Or is it about something more fundamental to knowledge? And how we create communities, and the whole idea of critical thought that we bring in. So my sense here is that a lot of the work that needs to be done, the threats, that's also why the issue you raised about autonomy, the way autonomy was reinterpreted by many of the regimes. You say you want autonomy, okay, we'll give you autonomy. You go and find your money and go and find your everything and this and that. But that doesn't tell you, actually, we can demand for public resources, but universities are self-governing institutions. And like every self-governing institution, they are the last to know when they are reeking of bad odor. Okay? Self-governing institutions are particularly dangerous because they will be rotten to the core and fall apart before they realize that they are rotten. The damage, the threat to academic freedom, for instance. People talk in the South African context. The state is not the danger to academic freedom. Other academics. It's one of the most authoritarian environments. You are in the senior professor, you are at the academic promotions committee meeting, and a young fellow who argued with you and said something and this and that, you can shoot down the person said something. And they know. They know you don't argue with Professor A and B because that's it, you're finished. When we are reviewing people's, grant applications at the central something, do I look at this and say, I don't like this idea and I'm going to shoot it down? In other words, a lot of these things in terms of, we've already turned it, I don't think there's a need to persuade government. Most governments recognize this. And this is where I think the question of individual and collective responsibility in a recovery of higher education research, fundamentally as public good, but driven by quality and grounded in our own environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think, yes, just now open the floor to Sam, and then, yeah. I don't
Hello?
watch, so.
Yeah, okay, good. He ended, I was getting worried, but he ended on the note that I was thinking about. Yeah, first of all, because it's good that Codestra is actually convening this scene, and I think that we have to tell the story of the agency in resisting and fighting against the marketization, and Codestra has been at the center of this for a very long time. And I can come back to that. Because in the first place, I think the discussion as we're taking, there are certain systemic ways in which the marketization has occurred. Primarily, the compression of wages, intellectual labor, the value of throughout the last 3 decades, and which is why we have all these processes of labor, intellectual labor mobilized into triple teaching schedules in so many universities. The whole redeployment of labor also into informal economic activities to survive. So you have a whole structural way in which the conditions for marketization are created. That's one. Second aspect, structural, is the whole offshore or exporting of the knowledge-making process or its domination from outside. And there are many different ways, not only through the different universities. The so-called privatization of universities in Africa, there's a huge element of it is really externally an offshore process. Not only that, even the fact that the development agents, these funding agencies from the North finance most of the research through their own agencies, which subcontract what Thomas Chopper used to call the monkey work of collecting. Huh? Yeah, yeah, or what Tandika calls, we do the working, they do the networking. Yeah, so there are all sorts of mechanisms through which the whole process of labor, manipulation of intellectual labor. Okay, so I think those are, I would say some of the fundamental aspects that we should look at more clearly and ways in which people are trying to fight that. Okay, but on the agency side, the resistance, I think that we should, even though I'm representing Codestra also now, if you allow me to say so, I think we should also celebrate the fact that we have at the center of this has been the fight against this whole trend. And, through a sort of a Pan-African, and it's not just Codestra, because out of Codestra have been spawned a number of other networks, Austria's and the SAPES's and CBR, all sorts of African institutions that whose mode of operation seeks to, if you like, stretch the limited resources and knowledge that is being brought together to kind of valorize it and within the knowledge production process itself and the dissemination process. So I think, I've seen the many books that we have about higher education, this and so forth. What about all these movements and, the way the tactics are changing, the way we have to start changing the tactics now as Codestra to improve upon our methods of struggling against this marketization. Thank you.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, I'm Oyana, and first of all, I apologize if I say something not good. It's only product of my ignorance. Okay. Yeah, I have actually like kind of 4 questions. The first one is like, it seems to me that all the universities are kind of running in the same direction, like homogen, and competing between them. To some point, I don't really see like which is this point, like without a clear objective, just competing. And my first question is, who is the one making the decisions? Who is the one that has defined this point, where this objective, where all the universities are running towards? And who should it be? Like in your opinion, who should be the one that should define in each case for each university and each specific context what a university should do? And I really like I don't know if I have get it, but your definition of universities is not about training, but about giving people the opportunity to give answer to the questions that are not, something like that. It was great. I didn't have the time to, And that was the first question. The second question is, do you think all the shifts that universities are being exposed to are bad changes? Like, for example, talking about two things: evaluation, this accountability and assessment, and also the relations between universities and industries, because I think there could be some good points on them. Because, for example, linking it to the conversation about the poverty eradication, they talked about a program, I don't remember the name, but that wasn't being evaluated. Like, the results of these programs weren't being evaluated, and I think maybe evaluating education policy in somehow and to some grade could be good. I don't know. I would like you to talk about it. And also the same with university, industry, and also government relations. Maybe, and with all fields of knowledge, not only economy. I'm an economist, I have to say, but no, with all fields of knowledge. Like, from these conversations, I think they could, like, not only think in market terms, but in really relations and communication terms. I think really good things could come from that relations. I also wanted to know your opinion there. And another question was how to equilibrate all these things, because if you start having relations with industry or whatever, how to equilibrate all these things. And the last one is, how do you think all this topic could be related to the previous topic of poverty eradication? How could we build all together, and like not all together, but each country, or I don't know, how could we link this to poverty eradication? Thank you.
Okay. Yes, Alfred.
I'm afraid I don't have a question. I just want to share some British experience with what both of you have articulated, and I'm really impressed with some of what you said, and I'm just wondering when we said that the gloom is over. Okay, in Britain, we started having marketisation in the social sciences, well, in universities, since the 80s. I mean, for example, right through the 80s, there was only one job on Africa that was advertised in any British, in The Guardian, for example, where they are. Only one job that was advertised right through the 80s relating to Africa, and this was a lectureship in history in Staffordshire University. Why? Because for them, Africa was not important anymore. But, the question of the market, for me, I find difficult, and I'll tell you why. Because if you talk about the market, you talk about something that sells, something that people want to buy, and people want to buy, intellectually because it's good. So when the Vice Chancellor of Birmingham University decided to close down the Department of Cultural Studies, the leading department in the country, perhaps one of the leading ones in the world, closed it down. Yes, this was Stuart Hall's department, those of you familiar with this issue. Closed it down, yes, because it was sociology, and what did they bring? Something totally different, yes. In another university, in Kiel, they closed down the Department of Economics because they wanted to bring lots of Chinese students in. I guess that's market, because the Chinese students, 10 Chinese students will probably pay for a professor and stuff like that. So the neoliberal thing, this was one that affected, because under Thatcher picked on groups individually, first the workers. And in the context of sociology, you remember there was a total confusion among people like Thatcher between sociology and socialism. They failed to realize that sociology too is the bastion of reaction. All sociologists were socialists who would vote them out or who march against them on the street. So there was that problem, antagonism, sociology departments were closed, and I mean, those of you connected with Britain will know this. Lots and lots of sociologists sought refuge in places like health studies, organizational studies. Only a handful of us say, damn, sociologists. That's how we were trained. Yeah. So the other thing they did, and I think this is where you both are right, what they did, they said, well, you know, we're going to fund things now that students want to do. Yes. And of course, in that case, sociology would always win. Because students want, what is sociology about? Critical mind. They want to know why things are happening and why things are not happening. So they said, well, yes, if you could find students, we'll finance you. And sociology had a breath of fresh air. We started recruiting students again. Yeah. But unfortunately, because of cultural genre, because of things like Cracker, those of you who are familiar with the British television scene, people who normally would come into sociology started going into criminology because they felt that this is what they were saying. So the sociology number did not collapse, but lots and lots of people who would have gone into sociology went that way. So, but then, of course, eventually, student fees came in. Student fees came in, and the first thing that happened with student fees is that mature students disappeared. Yes, we started now, even in those institutions like mine that prided ourselves in bringing a mature student, now we find that our programs were dominated by 18-year-olds. Nothing wrong with 18-year-olds, but simply because they are ready to deal with the debt in future. Yes. I see he's in a little bit of trouble with the wife. Yeah. So we have that with the market. And again, the point about Uganda, I thought when you made that point, what came to mind? Remember, Uganda, as far as the IFIs were concerned, Uganda, together with Ghana, perhaps much more so than Ghana, were seen as a success story of SAPS. Yes, and of course it was because of one guy one dictator who decided to stay. So for me, if we talk about the social sciences, because if you see with psychology, of course, they don't want anything to do with us. They think they're science. Yes, in Britain, in my own university, they're in science. And in some cases, you take politics. Politics they're having a hard time in Britain right now. You know, we say politics, we don't say political science. They're having a hard time in terms of recruiting. And I know departments now where they're closing down things like history. Even Liverpool University, they were going to close down philosophy, they were going to close down this, they were going to close that down. Yeah, and simply because these are departments where they feel the market is not working as defined. Yes, as defined. Because now what a lot of universities are doing is to market themselves in terms of sixth form conferences, so young people know about their programs, etc. But I mean, I just thought I find this debate very interesting, and you know, as I said, we've gone through it. We are still going through it. Yes, because as you know, in Britain now, we specialize in taking money from poor people and giving them to the same bankers who messed up things. Yes, and of course, when you take money from ordinary people to give to bankers, eventually you have to pay those ordinary people back. And in the process of paying those ordinary people back, they're going to take money from universities and they're going to close programs, etc. So.
Very good, Jack. Yeah.
I was worried a bit there when Jimmy said they didn't take people with second lower. in his university. Some of us wouldn't have gone to graduate school, but that's another story. I mean, I had been asked by Pinky to make a few comments here, so I'll take advantage of standing here to do that. I want to take the debate slightly in another direction around the constitution of disciplines and the extent to which in a World Social Science Forum, if we talk from the perspective of Africa or the South, to what extent are we part of the definition of what these studies are about? I think that is of utmost importance, because then we are either dealing with a subject which is global in nature, or in terms of epistemology, it comes from a certain thought process or is dominated by certain thought processes. So I think it's important in dealing with this matter to ask those questions. And indeed, possibly the marketization process comes from some part of the world, and therefore that's why I move in that direction. What is the answer from our side on these matters? I think it's important also, as we critique these things, to say, what do we present as alternatives in relation to these matters? Yesterday, I went to a commission of, parallel session dealing with the UNESCO World Report on social sciences, and there was, presentations from different parts of the world. And when it came to Africa, and it was again also, I think, the issue of labeling and standards and who defines. We were defined as sub-Saharan Africa, yet we're a continent in which North Africa is part of the continent. So I think, even with international organizations, these are debates that we would have to be involved in terms of who defines who, who labels, in terms of power and so on and so forth. But the long and short of it is that with regards to Africa, after the United States had presented and given us, glowing indications of what is happening in the social sciences over there, there was a whole debate around the ISI and the issue of citations. And so African journals, who writes where. But the interesting part about it was when I asked the question to the researcher, in terms of these citations, do you ask people what country they come from? Because if Africa is losing over 20,000 people annually and they write in journals in the US, then the US figures go up, but unfortunately Africa's figures are down. So I think even around issues of standards, assessments, ranking, and so on and so forth, we must bring this debate to the fore. A few weeks ago, there was an email doing the rounds, and I don't know whether, Jimmy, you were part of that email, with Godwin Moranga and others, about people based in the diaspora, Codestria, and if you go to conferences in Africa, it's not worth a graduate student conference in the US. These, for me, in terms of marketization, are important issues, because then people take their worth in relation to some of these standards which are set outside the continent. So I think at some point, we would need to ourselves bring these issues to the fore. I have looked around in this very forum itself, in terms of it's a World Social Science Forum, but then again in terms of representation, how well represented are we? Certainly there is male dominance, but not, it's white male dominance also. So these are things that I think outside and apart from the kinds of debates that you were raising are of importance, because they themselves influence a number of things in terms of the contents of the studies, where we take the studies to, and so on and so forth. But I think with the African Academy, we must also ask a number of questions as to the relevance of African academies in certain situations. Because if universities also, or social studies or social sciences, deal with things which are so far removed from local situations, then sometimes governments ask why they should be funded. So I think it's also important for us to make the point for the relevance of the subjects that we're involved in. And, I think the whole debate this morning around climate change and social scientists and so on is part of what the debate is about. And of course, if climate change is going to affect us most on the African continent, then where are we in speaking about the droughts and the environmental change in rain patterns? I didn't know it rained in the northern part of South Africa in May, but just before we came, I suppose people were saying it was showers of blessing for Jacob Zuma, that it rained on the day that he was being inaugurated. But you'd normally not have rain in May in Tswane. But these are changes. Our parents tell us, you would not have rain at this time of the year during their time. So I think that relevance, is important in terms of moving forward. I think that the issue of funding, is a critical and important one. But some people might ask whether indeed we don't have funds in the developing South, but that the funds go elsewhere. So, we talk about we will not be able to meet the Millennium Development Goals and so on and so forth. But these are for a very rich continent. So again, prioritization. And if we're telling, truth to power, we then need to bring these things also to the fore, that, we can't continue to have this begging bowl syndrome and pretend that we must be funded from outside. The funders come in, they determine the agenda, and we get upset. I think we must determine our own agendas. After all, the Association of African University Chancellors have put forward a program of action for the continent. And this is what we should be seeking to be implemented in terms of moving forward. I think the brain drain is something we must talk about also in terms of marketization of the social sciences, and begin to ask ourselves, how do we create conditions to ensure that, yes, we can't stop people from moving, but if they must move, are there possibilities that they can give back to the continent? I think, for me, those are going to be important issues. And that debate which was had about sabbaticals and that, we must take it and unpack it and see if indeed there might be some truth in what people are saying, but change their minds about ensuring that they come and be experts on Africa, because otherwise you're going to have other people who are experts and we're going to be unhappy about it. Thanks.
Very good. Can you start to take that? Should you go first or you go first? Either way.
Okay. It's the day is far gone, and I would like to try and keep this short. But there are a number of these issues that I think it's important to respond to. I don't think that there was a conspiracy. You asked the question, who is making the decisions? I don't think that somebody sat down. There's some of those things, even within the World Bank, there were debates within the World Bank, but it was a logical consequence of the way in which you assess public financing, and of course the fundamental, analytical flaw in the private returns argument is, a very simple thing. If you fund your son to become a medical doctor, a dentist, your son or your daughter doesn't just set up a dental something in your house and treat only family members. Okay? If a child is trained by the parents to become to be an engineer, you don't only fit your parents' vehicles. You're an engineer for the whole country. And people understood that. The externalities to this. But the externalities are not bad. They're positive because they're about building national capacity. But the problem is this. Let me use just one illustration from a university in which I was very familiar. If you pull resources, let's say you cut the funding of a university by 50%. You got a vice chancellor, you got a whole something, you got a head of, you can't pay for this, electricity, you can't meet the bill because the national electricity something says this, how much you are owing, the same thing with water and this and that. And then people start scrambling for what to do, okay? To try and meet some of this. First, the immediate impact is there's a cut in a number of services. So you have to buy your own stationery, you have to buy something, libraries gets affected, and you try and, the usual, stabilization thing. And then, and this is the interesting thing, now I remember this quite clearly, that you then had, the academics are entrepreneurial, okay? They can sell you poison and make you feel that it's the best thing you've ever bought. Let's do this. 80% of the proposals were right. Don't we exaggerate the problem so that we can get money? We're good at this. No, I'm not me. No, I'm just saying that this is what it tends to happen.
There are donors in the room.
No. I think it's important to be quite clear about a number of these things. Look, take the example yesterday, somebody talking about X number of people die of HIV/AIDS in South Africa. Give me a break. HIV is not a notifiable disease in South Africa. So how did you can't even put on somebody's medical something that the person has AIDS. So how did you collect your data? But you need to do that so that you can say this is a major problem. But that's the way you make money, okay? So now, what happened initially, or people in the economics department, people who have industrial relations team, because there's also pressure from outside, people who wanted to have certificates. education, but they couldn't afford to come to the university. So they then, offer to the university, we can float these programs, okay? And then this is the cost sharing, that's the language, the revenue sharing formula. So we will give 50% to the university, and then 50% to take care of the expenses of people, all right? Now, your bossa is very happy because somebody just brought money in, okay? The person launches it, and then 2 weeks down the line, he changes his car. And then the guy in philosophy start wondering, okay, how do we do? Okay, let's talk about crime. There are philosophical issues in crime. So you run a program for people in Ministry of, the Correctional Services, prisons. Then you have and then it cascades. Because there's then a stampede in that direction because it's incentive structure. I mean, that's what this thing about adjustment, about changing the incentive structure, the structure of incentive. And it becomes a tidal wave. It happens in trading, when people talk about longhorns and things like that. In any case, human beings are largely like cattle. Okay? Like people, rearing cattle in the Sahel. There's a big bull with long horn. When it goes in one direction, 80% will follow. And this and that. When you see sheep, for instance, cross the road, goats are better. Not in Southern Africa. No. Yeah, okay. No, I'm just. I mean, listen, and that's what tends to happen. I mean, look, let's be honest. Postmodernism 1 year, you look, leave a university and come back in 10 years, you can't understand the language. Meanwhile, 80% is just regurgitating what somebody else said. It's cattle regress syndrome. The cattle move one way and 90% of academics move in the other direction. When the changes, everybody move in the other direction, and this and that. And it's about incentive. It wasn't that somebody plotted. It's precisely the same mechanism that you can use to change. Let's take, for instance, in the context of South Africa. History is a sorely missing subject. History. And yet, you can use the same thing where you say, for instance, the subsidy for a graduate in history is doubled. Okay? You double the graduation system in South Africa. For every student the university graduates, there's a money pay. It's called subsidy. You pay for it and this and that. Now, you can say, at the moment, drama counts about 3 times more than history. Okay, drama. Okay? But if you say history now counts at the same level as chemistry, it means every PhD student you get in chemistry, in history, is worth 5 in other areas. There will be an incentive for people to attract, and this and that. So it wasn't that there was a conspiracy. And I think it's important to understand it. The question about evaluation, I mean, look, there's a question of accountability. We can't use public resources and pretend as if we cannot be accountable. That's not the same thing about the way people have used accountability. Reflections, for instance, is important. One of the best things that ever happened to me was about within 3-4 years after my PhD, for me to get this grant saying 25,000 called Rockefeller Reflections on Development. And I was told I could spend 6 months in any library anywhere in the world, put my feet up for 6 months, and think about my field. But that's probably produced some of my best works, which has policy implications, which has pedagogic implications, and this. Now, but let's look at what actually has happened in many areas. In my university, it started off as what's called developmental. You help teachers to become better teachers, you put all these things, then you have student evaluation of teaching. When you design a survey instrument, you talk about what? Internal, okay. Actually think about it. Student evaluation of teaching in this assessment regime, what has it done? It was supposed to be an evaluation of teacher effectiveness, isn't it? Teacher effectiveness. But actually what it has promoted is teacher likability. I'm not a comedian when I get into class, okay? I like to make my class interesting, and you can see probably, I like to make my class interesting, but for goodness sake, you work hard, I work hard, you work hard. You don't walk into my 3 or 4 classes and think you can come and tell me some story the other day and next day and this. But if I do that, I get bad something from, because the evaluation. And then in the context of South Africa, when you find students start making what are clearly very racist comments about a particular professor, okay, how do you evaluate that? So But my sense is this. I can't tell you what best practices is in university level. I can tell you 2 things you must do, 2 things you must not do. 2 things you must do: be prepared. Every time you walk into the classroom, be prepared, okay? 2, be passionate about your field. If you're passionate, if you're excited about your field every time you walk into the class, the students will catch the vibe, okay? It doesn't matter what subject you're teaching, okay? 2 things you must never do. Never denigrate your students. There are no stupid questions. Never denigrate your students. 4th, the second thing you must never do, never pretend to be an oracle, okay? Never pretend that you have an answer to everything. Never feel that every time there's a question asked in the class, you must have an answer. If you don't have an answer, say, look, I actually never thought of it that way, okay? But can we convert that into a research thing? Can we all look up in the library and something and come back into the class tomorrow and this and that? Beyond that, I don't know what best practice is at university level, because university is not like primary school. University education is about training people who can answer in 20 years' time questions we cannot even formulate today. The people who invented cell phones were not trained to do cell phones. They were trained in fundamental physics, fundamental mathematics. People will flower their imagination. If you told my great-grandmother that you can have a small piece in your hand and be talking to somebody in Australia, she will tell you it's witchcraft. What are you doing with that? Okay, all right, it's okay. Okay, but you know, I mean, the ideas flower, and they go into unintended consequences. People unintended direction. People who fund basic research, even from a market logic principle, you fund basic research because the consequences of basic research you can't predict. When Ronald Reagan started talking about Star Wars, and I remember people were saying, "Hey, it will never happen." I said, "No, that's not the thing. It's not whether they will achieve the objective, it's the spin-off that will emerge. Computing power today. Believe me, when I was doing my PhD, when you start your SPSS, drive A, your program disk, drive B, your data disk, then your PC something, then you go and talk to everybody in the institute and come back. Maybe your data has finished analyzing, okay? You couldn't even do things like the type 1 and type 2 error we know, because of small data size, because the algorithm was not available. Today, some of these desktop computers will knock the socks off you or something. The computer that put Neil Armstrong on the moon had 512 kilobyte memory. This has about 3 megabytes. So even the logic of basic research, and that's what I'm saying about even the promotion of genome project, for instance, okay? You can say it may have implication, we know, maybe we have, but we wouldn't know from the moment. It's important for that purpose to do that. So can you, university, industry, government, something, actually don't take too much of the, when we are among ourselves, we tell about, radical scholarship and this and that. Actually, the origin of universities, they were supposed to serve the Lord. Okay? They were supposed to serve the Lord. And I'm open to, if you're a right-wing economist, as long as you're rigorous. If you're left-wing economist, as long as you're rigorous. If you're middle something social democratic economics, as long as you're rigorous. Don't tell me you're left-wing and give me, rubbish, work. I mean, like the guy who's talking about bottom billion. I mean, it's bad economics. No. Purely from a technical something in terms of economics. It's bad economics, okay? It's about that rigor. And my sense, and I'm talking to you, not the rest, is that have the courage that your PhD work, by the time you finish, you are the expert on that subject. When you walk into your oral vival examination and this and that, you're the expert. But that's because you work your backside off, okay? A PhD is not a measure of intelligence. It's a measure of endurance. That's because if you are not bright, you won't be here, okay? But there are many bright people who fell by the roadside. But it's important, but I don't think that one can say one way or the other. Final thing and this that, okay? I think you mentioned the cultural studies. Actually, one of the things that happened in this process was the way in which power relations within university altered. That's what I'm talking about. The threat to reconfiguration of higher education and university and research is internal. Because in University of Ibadan, at its height, at its most glorious something, A vice chancellor was a professor who earned on top of his professorial salary, what do you call a responsibility allowance as a vice chancellor. That's all. Today, the average vice chancellor earns 4 times. Then you have this differentiation they tell us. If you are in an attractive area, we will pay you market rate. So what do you pay the philosopher? Yeah. What do you pay the physicist, mathematician, if you're not in the applied? Can you do knowledge at all without philosophy? Okay? And that's the thing. There's been also an internal, differentiation, and depending on the nature of the environment. That's why this debate must start in our Senate, in our faculty boards, and fight these issues on the ground. That whether the thing, and that's why I will end on this thing. One of the debates we've had in the context of Rhodes University, and you know this, my brother. In South Africa, you paid, there's what they call research subsidy. For every journal article in an accredited journal, something, there's 86,000 that is paid to your university as part of the research funding. In some universities, they share that money with researchers. So you produce 4 papers in crappy journals, but they're on something, they can produce 8. Then you share the money. So if you get 20,000 for FQ advance, it's 160,000. We refused. This debate was an extensive one at Rhodes University to say we must put all that money into one basket, because we don't do research so that we can be paid. Anyway, you do research so you enjoy what you're doing. But the money must then be available for the young ones, okay, the ones who are not able to attract grants external, because that's the only way you can build the thing up. And then you avoid perverse incentive. If I start thinking at the end of the year, I need to replace my hi-fi, how much is it going to cost? 100,000. Okay, if I'm able to publish 5 journals, regardless of quality, you can do 2 regression analysis and get it published. Okay, there's a lot of that. Okay, and then you publish the papers. You look at some papers, at the end of the day, you ask, what is the point? What is the message here? There's nothing substantive. And yet, this is the example, and the final example, it was in UCT. One paper by one person on the origin of diamond, which was published in Nature. That was the only journal article he had for the year, which was a Nobel Prize winning one. And then there was somebody who published 8 articles in Ostrich. Ostrich, this journal, Ostrich. 8. If you were to use that as an incentive, that person will get 80,000, the other person will get 10,000. Yet that one paper is worth 50 of these other ones. And I think it's important.
Thank you very much, Jimmy, for the clarifications. Let me just, when you talk about internal, and Sam's question as to what is the response that has been attempted, and somebody else also asked the same question. I think when with that document, the Declaration on Academic Freedom and Social Responsibility, that has been the angle from which, from the point of view of CODESRIA, this issue has been tackled in making sure that actually, while we struggle for autonomy and for academic freedom, we also pay attention to ethical issues, but also to the quality of the work we do and to the social responsibility issues. Let me just go a little bit, further on this one. The pressures are internal. The problems are internal. I agree to a certain extent, and this is what the social responsibility issues are also dealing with. But even the internal ones are overdetermined by what is happening in the environment. And what Burove is arguing in this critique of the Gulbenkian Commission report is that actually the universities and the social sciences more specifically are subjected to a dual pressure from the market, but also from the state. That has been a key agent in the promotion of the market logic in the social sciences and the universities. And the state actually has been doing it in both ways, both directly by encouraging it, but also by policing the universities so that they comply. Basically, yeah, that has been a very important thing. I think many of the things like what Zach was saying about what is happening in sociology, criminology being important. I think I said in my presentation that there is a differentiation taking place at various levels. There's a differentiation among countries, a differentiation among disciplines, and differentiation within disciplines. And criminology actually is cited by some of the authors as being one of the growth areas in sociology. There are other aspects of sociology that aren't doing well at all. There is also the fact that political science may not be doing well in the UK. Maybe it's the kind of political science that is being taught because we know that certain disciplines have also invaded other disciplines. I mean, economics has exported a lot of its own stuff to other disciplines. Sociology has done that also in another aspect, but economics has been particularly, and geography, exactly, pervasive in what was happening. So that this is all what this guy called the third wave of. In terms of the link with industry, I think Jimmy has addressed the issue. The point really is not to say that there shouldn't be any link with industry. But if the universities are starved of funding, if the disciplines are, obliged to secure funds in all kinds of ways, and then they're told, look, by developing relationships with industry, you get funded. It impacts on the nature of the research being carried out in several different ways. It becomes demand driven, and not that there shouldn't be any kind of demand driven thing, but that becomes the primary pressure on the disciplines. The agenda for research is set, therefore, by those commissioning the research, in a sense, and that's one of the problematic aspects of it all. Who is deciding on the agenda? I think that has also been addressed. Basically, where things are working very well, universities are expected to be autonomous and therefore to be deciding on what they are doing. There's just so many issues I don't know which ones to take. No, really, I think the problem, the African academies, the point has been made in terms of where the agendas are set. The constitution of disciplines, the fact that I think I made that point as well. We are dealing with the market, we are dealing with pressures from the state, from the market, but also within the field, in academia itself, there are power relations that exist. And I think examples you cited are very good in that sense. The fact that what determines the quality of scholarship is not entirely with us. It is a struggle, actually. What determines, when you publish in a journal that is outside, it's supposedly an international journal, even though some of the international journals are published in Africa, you are better rated as a scholar if you publish in the Cambridge Journal of something than if you publish in Codesria journal. So, and even if it is the same stuff, even if Codesria journals actually are being sought after by international, multinational publishing houses like Sage and other companies like that. So there is there's all sorts of dynamics here, which brings in a whole sort of issues. And this is actually the struggle that is being waged around Codesria in particular, where the other example is the indexation. We have an African indexation project as a way of trying to find responses. The Africa Review of Books is supposed to be creating a forum where people can debate and actually set other criteria that so you don't have leave to others the monopoly of determining what is of quality and what is relevant, but also the academy. And I think that's the strength of Roland Vass is here. We've done so much work on the emergence of scientific communities. But I think it's a mark of the strength of a scientific community to be able to determine the criteria for what is good scholarship, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, and so on. And I think that is also what we are dealing with here. So in a sense, I think this is. I'm not sure whether there are any more contributions, but just to. You want to say something, Suleiman? Okay, let me just take one more and then maybe wrap up. Yeah. Yes, Suleiman?
Conflict of interest immediately. I'm in publishing and I've got a conflict of interest in the sense that the whole essence of the reason why I'm in the business is I want to market social science research. That's what I want to do. I want to market it, and social science research. I want to market that knowledge. Is the basis of the business, and the whole, because at the end of it all, the mathematics must work, the economics must work. Granted and relevant, the whole importance of knowledge production and knowledge generation for the community, for the society, and all is there. But now, because publishing is just one aspect within that spectrum, and serves as an the intermediary to the larger community, to making this work that you people have done accessible and comprehensive to the larger community. There are certain ways of doing things, and there are certain ways of making it go to the larger community that a bit of market logic it's necessary and it's critical. But I am interested in a manuscript. I'm interested in an author that is going to be able to tell me, that'll be able to market itself and tell me this is why my work can be distinguished from other millions of work out there, and what are the approach I'm going to use to run it. And your presentation was very, very good, and your presentation focused a lot on the history, the context, the driving forces, and the nature of the beast, of how the whole process of homogenization is going on, and how this homogenization is affecting any field, not just social sciences research, all field. There's a process of homogenization. The Akatu, something is there. But the marketization of social is not necessarily bad. I mean, what is critical is that at what level is being marketized, or at what level is the use of market thinking primordial in the generation and production of knowledge. That is what is critical. Because at every level in the spectrum, there will be an element of competition. Marketization has an element of competition. The best, may the best win. And when institutions compete for scholars, compete to hire faculty, to bring so person into their faculty, it's also part of, and I'm not looking at it from a neoliberal, but it's all about that talent, trying to bring in talent from various parts of the world to be able to distinguish, to be able to produce strong research work from your faculty. And all those questions of what are you doing, what discipline is strong in this university, who are the researchers there, why should I join them, why should I be part of them, will I promote my agenda, my school of thought, and everything will come into being before such faculty. And it's how, and you're perfectly right that various communities are being affected by the marketization of social science in different ways. And maybe what is going on somewhere in a place like America and Europe, there could be slight differences in terms of what is going on in terms of what's going on in Africa, in Asia, and all that view, given the different context and the development of education in those two contexts, and the role of education in those two contexts as well. So it's at what level, with what tools, with what when. Those are the critical elements.
Okay.
I just said
Very
I should
good.
point
Yeah.
it out. It's
Very
not a
good.
contradiction.
Yeah, I mean, I think really what we have tried to do here is to say, first of all, that the discussion has been very much in the literature about marketization in higher education, and the focus on the social sciences and what is happening in social sciences, specifically. There is a lot of work to do here. There is a lot of work to do here. It's tackled usually in passing in a number of papers and articles, but very few focus on the disciplines, the social science disciplines, and how they've been affected, the impact of the marketization, and how they've been responding to the marketization. I think there's really a lot more to do here. One of the main problems, really, has been the narrow instrumentalization of science, and a kind of utilitarian logic that has been really dominant, and that is a big problem. I think there's room for, even in Codesria from the beginning, people said they were interested in promoting basic research, but also in what was called problem-solving research. So it's not a question of saying we are not taking interest in trying to find answers to issues that are here today, to problems that are here today. But then again, we know that the capacity to find answers to problems is actually dependent on the extent to which you understand the problems to start with, and that you cannot do in the absence of basic research, even if you can take questions of basic research from policy research. And that is what the marketization has made difficult these days. Through the funding regimes, and through the fact that apart from the funding also, we, in our own context in Africa, we are dealing with governments that really have been carried over. It's interesting to hear that the Vice Chancellors protested when the World Bank said higher education was not needed in Africa. The little that we needed of it, we could send people to Europe and elsewhere. It was more cost effective to sell them to be trained elsewhere, and then we do. But we didn't hear the government's protest. I mean, the Vice Chancellors are at one level. It could be instead a question of promoting their own survival, basically. If you declare the universities unnecessary, you are saying them, you guys, you're going to be redundant, right, if you close down the universities. But, I mean, beyond that, what is the extent to which African governments are sticking their necks out to defend knowledge production, core knowledge production? It's a big problem. It is nowhere in the NEPA documents. It is nowhere in the major policy documents of the AU. It's only now that the ministers are making statements, ministers of higher education. But so we have a particular challenge that we have to face. And we have this awkward situation in which we want to produce knowledge, we want to do research, and we want to do research with money that we can raise 3/4 of the time from outside of the continent, basically. It's a serious issue. There are countries where they set aside money in South Africa and elsewhere where they give incentives to scholars who did it. But I think without the support of the donors, we would have been in big trouble. And now you enter into a completely different realm in which some of the donors leave you the space to do the research on the basis of what you think you ought to be doing in response to the questions that are posed in your own context. And the 3/4 of them don't leave you that space. They are interested in one topic. Do research for us on Zimbabwe today. We want to know what is it that is holding Mugabe in power until today. I mean, that's the kind of questions you can get. So this is a debate that has to continue. I'll leave you the floor, Jimmy, to round up and then close this thing. But I think there is a lot to do in terms of just trying to understand, what is happening to the social sciences in the context of the neoliberal onslaught that has been going on. I think the one thing Jimmy said is very important. I think today nobody is championing neoliberalism as it used to be done before the crisis that occurred recently. So that is a reason for being optimistic at the global level. But I think there's still a lot more.
Well, yeah.
Can we request that this sits on our agenda and pedestrians?
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, let me just end on the note that and to make a distinction between incentive, quality, and mechanism for quality assurance, and when it tips over into, take publishing as an example. There was a time when you had vibrant university publishing houses. Dar es Salaam, Ibadan had its own something and this and that. And they were funded and they operated not purely on what is the volume of the books you can sell. It's a niche area, you probably not be able to sell. But there was an understanding of a commitment to that. All right. Now, they occupied a niche within the spectrum of the publishing industry. But there's also another end of the publishing industry that was dealing with mills and booms. Okay? Where you can produce 1 million copies and sell, and you make profit out of that, including many of the highbrow publishing houses. The university has. So there is that differentiation. I think even in the most egalitarian, let's come back to the question of social policy, for instance. I mean, what I find particularly, useful, that if you take the argument, for instance, beyond targeting and universalization as if they are mutually exclusive things, you can have a situation where you develop incentive systems that rewards excellence, that encourages excellence, but does it in a cooperative way, and at the same time, lending hand to the ones who are weak within the system. Okay, so for instance, the whole idea about promotion, let's forget about whether you are paid or you are not paid. When your first book is published, it's like giving birth to a baby. Okay, you probably would never. No, it's like having a new baby. No. Sorry, it's like having a new baby. But you've just worked your... No, look, No. Even the process of writing can be painful also, like pregnancy and this. But the point I'm making there is this. You probably knew at that particular point, you're not going to be rich with this book, okay? You're not like somebody selling a book writing a book that can publish. You can get, if they pay you $2 for every copy and it sells 5 million, you're okay, okay? But it's an intrinsic thing, okay? But at the same time, and that's why I encourage the Rhodes University something, and it took a lot of fight, huh? If I can talk to the Minister of Higher Education and we can legislate it, is to prevent people taking money out of their research something. Because you can then say, we generate resources, the resources are in, but we then look and say, in a solidaristic manner, how do we provide resources for younger scholars who are not able to pick up the phone and call a program officer and say, look, I'm thinking of this idea. And the program officer will help you write the proposal and say, look, put it in this direction and this and that. You ask for 50,000. He said, actually, we can give you 65,000. Okay? In other words, you can do that. What happened in this particular context that we're dealing with, in its worst instant, it was not about quality. It was not about something. It was just crass, what do you call it, selling and buying. People will run 2-week programs and give somebody certificate. The person who gave the certificate can't do the work. The person who's giving the certificate is just waving a piece of paper. MBA. I mean, if you look at, and I'll end here, look at the number of business schools that emerge all over the world. Yeah. And look at the rubbish they've done with the whole system. Somebody on South African radio every morning, somebody is telling me the rand moved by this something, it's retreat, is in the territory, negative territory, and they can tell you what happened, why it happened. I mean, I can't even tell you what is happening in the bedroom of my children. How much more telling you which, traders are doing something around the world. You know what I mean? You just, so that's the point.
Thank you very much, everybody. And then we'll continue this in the coffee break and later. Thank you. Thanks.